Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ABCs to Landscape Watering Virtual Workshop. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Drew Raustein. I'm with the City of Chandler Water Conservation Office. I'll be handing the presentation over once I cover a few items here. The workshop is part of several virtual workshops the City of Chandler and the Town of Queen Creek is excited to offer to our residents and guests this fall. This is our first virtual class, or I'm sorry, this is our second virtual class of the season being offered, and I'm hopeful that everything goes according to plan. It's definitely a new way to present these classes in advance. Please forgive us if we have any minor adjustments along the way. A few things before we begin, though. All class attendees will be muted for the duration of this workshop. If you have any questions or comments at any time during the presentation, you may type them in the Q&A box. I know there is a chat box, but there's also that Q&A box. You simply just click on the Q&A box, type in your question or comment there. One of our staff will be moderating that Q&A box throughout the class. When viewing the Q&A, you'll just want to have it in the all view so that you can see all the questions and answers. The default for the Q&A should be to all panelists, but just ensure that it is selected so that your questions can be viewed by and responded by all of the moderators. Everyone should have received reminder emails leading up to the class. Within those emails are class handouts that the instructor may reference or go over during the presentation. If any technical difficulties along the way, please feel free to contact us in the Q&A box or by email or the number listed here on the screen. Before we begin, we have a quick poll we would like everyone to complete. This poll will help us better understand our audience. I'll allow everyone about a minute to complete the poll questions. So let me pull that up real quick for you. Get that open. And there we go. All right, thanks everyone for completing those questions. I really appreciate your input. I would like to now introduce you and turn over the presentation to your instructor, Jeff Lee. He'll be teaching and providing you a wealth of knowledge about landscape watering.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeff Lee. I work with the Town of Gilbert Water Conservation Office, and this morning we're going to be talking about how to water your landscape. And that's the real important thing about what we're going to be working with you today is how to water your landscape. Not your neighbor's landscape, not my landscape, but watering your landscape. So the brochure that we're going to be reviewing today is the Landscape Watering by the Numbers. And you can see that Donna DeFrancisco is the one who created this presentation. Obviously, I'm not Donna. But Donna is one of the authors of this brochure, and she created this presentation, which follows along with the brochure very well, with all the charts and tables, just like you're going to see in the brochure. And she's gracious enough to allow the rest of us to actually use her presentation. So that works out really well for everybody, especially me. I don't have to create a whole new presentation. And let's see here. Arrow buttons don't want to work. So we'll use the mouse wheel. So one thing we do have to remember, we're not in Kansas anymore, or Ohio, or Minnesota, or wherever many of us came from. This is a totally new environment for many people who are newcomers here. We are in a desert, so that is defined by little amounts of rainfall, and we're seeing that to be especially true this summer with what we're referring to as our monsoon. Additionally, we do have low humidity, except for right now during our supposed monsoon season, If you go outside recently, you notice just how hot and sticky it is out there. So that actually does have a big impact on your plant water needs. Obviously, in the summertime, we do have those periods of high heat, especially this year where we've been breaking those records of number of days over 110 degrees. I think we're at 40 or so as of right now. Hopefully, we're going to see some relief here in the near future. We also do have quite a bit of wind here in the desert, and that also has a big impact on what's going on with the plant water needs. So when we actually measure plant water needs scientifically, we measure it by what we call evapotranspiration. So that's really just two words, evaporation, after the water is applied to the soil surface, either through irrigation or rainfall, some of it evaporates away. The rest of it, once it gets down into the root zone profile, is absorbed by the plants, brought up into the stems and out to the leaves. And there, it actually evaporates and exits the plant material through pores on the bottoms of the leaves called stomates. And they open and close in response to these different weather conditions, releasing a lot of that water as water vapor. So it's basically the same thing we're doing when we're outside, but we didn't want to call it evapotranspiration because that just wouldn't be very scientific. So we call it evapotranspiration, and your professional, truly trained irrigation personnel refer to that as simply ET. We also have what Donna refers here to as manipulated landscapes. And what we mean by that is we don't have the patience to just wait and see what kind of plants pop up and hope it's a plant we want in the place that we want. So we bring home plants in containers from the nurseries. So one of the things we have to do with new landscapes is we have to work on developing and getting those plants to grow those nice big root zones. Everyone thinks about watering plants and getting plants bigger, but really when it comes to irrigation, your focus needs to be on the roots. Focus everything you're doing on the roots and everything else is going to work out just fine. So we do have the different factors that do affect our irrigation or watering needs. Obviously, it's the climate we live in, but not only the climate, what season is it? What's going on with that wind, temperature, rainfall, humidity, and solar radiation? The wind, temperature, humidity, and solar radiation are the defining factors of that ET we talked about. Rainfall is not included in ET, but when we do have rainfall, the ET level actually drops because we have cloudier weather, lower temperatures, and higher humidity, so the plants are not giving up as much of that water vapor through that transpiration. And then additionally, whatever rainfall we get that is usable, you get that double bonus there. We do also have to think about our soil type. Predominantly, if you're living in the valley, you're pretty much going to have what's referred to as a clay loam soil. Mostly clay, but there is some organic material in there, just not as much as maybe we're used to if we came from somewhere else where you got that nice, rich, dark soil. Excuse me. But our soil actually works very, very well out here for growing plants. A lot of people don't like our soil because they don't understand it. They think we have really, really hard, terrible soil. And if we had such terrible soil, then our economy in the valley wouldn't have been based on agriculture for so many years. Clay soil is a very good soil to grow plant material in because it has a high water holding capacity. When you compare it to a sandy soil, that sand just can't hold on to the moisture. It either drains right through and it also evaporates out much more quickly than our clay soil. The soil condition comes into play if you're dealing with any kind of compaction issues. As that soil gets tromped on more and more and more, it becomes more and more compacted. Fortunately, most of our desert plants are used to a fairly compact soil, so they really don't have a hard time with it, although some of our non-native species will struggle with it a little bit. And if you've got a lawn, if you've got some high compaction out there, you're going to have some problems with some stunted growth and some thinning areas of the lawn. So in that case, what you're going to want to do is what's called a mechanical aeration. So go to your favorite tool rental center and rent an aerator. The kind you want to get is the one that's just a big 50-gallon drum put on its side with spikes welded on it. And you got a handle so you can roll it back and forth across the lawn area. Now, to make it heavy enough to actually penetrate the soil, you're going to fill that drum with water. There's a little screw-on cap with it. And what you're going to see is as you're rolling that back and forth across the lawn, you're going to be pulling out a lot of cores of soil, about an inch in diameter and about 4 inches long. That's really going to open up that soil. It's going to allow the water to penetrate better, and it's also going to allow that oxygen to get down to that root zone a lot better. For soil cover, what we're talking about are the mulches. And people from other areas get a little confused when we talk about the decomposed granite, those rocks out in your yard, as being a mulch. That actually is a mulch. It's what we refer to as an inorganic mulch. So it provides a lot of the same benefits as the mulches that we traditionally think of, where it provides that cover between the soil surface and the atmosphere. So it actually helps keep the soil where the roots of the plants are cooler, which lowers their plant water needs. If you don't have any decomposed granite out there and it's just bare, hard clay soil, you're going to have to water more often because the temperatures in those root zones is much higher. Additionally, you're going to find that the water does evaporate out a little quicker without that layer of decomposed mulch out there. While it doesn't break down and become nutrients for the plants, it is providing those other benefits. Of course, plant type is going to have a huge impact on how you're going to need to water your yard. Don't water an agave like a hibiscus or vice versa. Somebody's going to end up losing in that equation. And of course, plant size. This is a big one, and this is something that a lot of people don't think about, especially when they're dealing with new landscapes. You know, they just really drown those poor baby little plants and they say, oh, well, they're new plants, they need more water. If you think about it, a 2-foot wide shrub compared to a 25-foot wide tree, which one has more leaf surface area with all those stomates, those pores that open up and release that water? Who should have a bigger root zone, that tiny little new plant or a big established tree? Larger plants need more water when you do actually water them. And of course, microclimate is a big thing. We do have our climate out here, which is typically hot, but we also do have microclimates around our yard, and it's still warm enough to actually give this a little test. Wait till about 5 o'clock in the afternoon here, put on the thinnest t-shirt you own and go lean up against the west wall of your house that's in that direct sun. You can probably do that for about 3 to 5 seconds before your back begins to burn. Now walk to the other side of the house and lean up against that wall. You've just experienced a big temperature drop because you're not getting that radiant heat, that reflected heat on that other side. So actually you can use this to your benefit when you're doing some landscape design by putting some of your higher water use plants in those more protected microclimates. And maintenance does have a big play in how our plants are using water. And this is something that the plant people, the horticulturists and the botanists and the plant pathologists have been telling us for decades, that this practice we have in the valley, which is very strange, you really don't see it done anywhere else except for Disneyland. That's why we do call it the Disneyland effect. This practice of shearing our shrubs into these weird, strange shapes. So we try and make them round, but we really can't make them round. So it's really hard to do that with those long bladed head shears. So we end up with all sorts of things out there like cupcakes and gumdrops and beer kegs and corn silos. But when you do that, you're actually increasing the water demand of that plant. So remember, the leaves of the plants are making food for the plant. Remember that photosynthetic process we all learned about in junior high? Well, when you cut off a large portion of that foliage, you're removing the plant's food-making capability. Now, the plant will go into a response on that by going into an accelerated growth mode to try and regrow and regain its food-making capability, so that increases its water needs. Now, of course, when the plant begins growing faster to regain its food-making capability, that causes us to shear it even more often. So it's kind of strange, this practice that we have out here. Like I said, I've never really found it anywhere else in the country. But the other side of this is whenever I'm at a nursery and I'll see people, the number one reason why they pick one plant over the other is almost always flower color. First, they should make sure it's the right size plant for the area they want to put it in. But other than that, they will also almost always pick one plant over another because of the flowers. And then when it gets up to that size, they start shearing it and they almost never see any flowers on it again. It's a very strange concept, and it's been going on for decades, and we've been trying to get people better educated on it for a long time now. So one thing you also have to remember is that not only do these plants need water, obviously they need that, but those roots also need to be in an oxygenated environment. People get so focused on delivering water to these plants. Oh, these poor plants are stuck outside. They can't come into the air conditioner. So they just start pouring water and water and water on there. And pretty soon what happens is they fill up that entire root zone and saturate the soil with water, which drives out all the oxygen. So now all of a sudden the plants, especially our desert plants, are not used to being sitting in wet soil all the time. They don't have that oxygen. The roots will begin to rot. Now all of a sudden you've got decomposing organic matter, the roots of your plants, in an anaerobic area. So that's when anaerobic bacteria move in and begin to consume the rotting roots of your plants. Now at this point the plant begins to get sick, and what do we always do for a plant that looks sick? We give it more water. You're just accelerating the death of the plant at that point, and the nurseries do appreciate your repeat business. They really, really do. So one of the things you do want to do is if you have a plant that's in poor health, watering could be an issue, and it very well could be the issue, but you want to check to make sure before you just automatically start dumping more water on there. The other thing you're going to see with excess watering like that is you're going to interfere with the uptake of the nutrients, especially visible on our non-native plants. People do like to use a lot of our desert plants, and that's great. That's the best plants to use here. But people also like to use some of the other things that they really like, some of your more high water use plants, like your hibiscus, your gardenias, and your roses. And people will start to see the leaves on the plants are turning yellow. And in a lot of cases, the veins on the leaves are still a dark green, but the leaf surface itself is turning that bright yellow. That's called intraveinal chlorosis, and what that is showing you is a deficiency of iron. So you can go to a garden center and buy a product called chelated iron, mix it up with water, pour it on the root zone around the plant, and it will turn that plant nice and dark green. However, we already have iron in our soil. But what happens is if you don't let the soil dry out in between waterings, that iron is bound to the soil particles and the plants can't get at it. So instead of constantly retreating these plants with this chelated iron, change how you're watering, let it dry out somewhat, obviously not all the way, but somewhat in between waterings, and that problem goes away on its own. The other thing is water is a fantastic growth regulator, especially for our desert plants. You know, the bougainvilleas are a very popular plant out there, but nobody seems to enjoy pruning them because when you get done, you look like you just crawled out of a giant burlap bag filled with feral cats. Stop watering them so much and they stop growing so fast. So one of the benefits of using your desert adapted plant material out there is not only just using less water, it's also less maintenance than your more traditional high water use landscapes. You know, lots of grass that has to be mowed every week, and you know, your roses have to be deadheaded and all those sorts of things like that. So if you're out there pruning your bougainvilleas every week or two, you're probably watering them a little bit more than what they actually need. Now, the information we're going to give you is not to get you to underwater the plants. That doesn't do any good whatsoever. It doesn't do you any good because your plants won't look very good. And it doesn't do us any good because you'll never believe us again. So we do want you to use the water properly and use what you need. And that's really what water conservation, or perhaps a better term of that would be water management. That's using what you need and not using more than what you need. So studies from the University of Arizona and Arizona State University over years have shown that on average, Arizona landscapes are being watered 2 to 5 times more than what they really need. Now that's an average, so there are people out there who actually use less water on their landscapes than what our science tells us it needs. There are some people that do a pretty good job of watering, but a lot of people put way more water on those landscapes that they need. And there's some people out there that so heavily overwater, they actually end up skewing the average on that data. So there was another study that was done at the Desert Botanical Garden. This was done back in the 1990s. And they realized that all the people that work there were getting asked all the time, well, these are great. I like the way these desert plants look, but how do I water them? And it occurred to them that they didn't have a really good set of guidelines that everyone was giving to the people. So it depended on who you asked as far as what kind of advice you'd get. So they took this area that was outside of the view of paying public so they could actually torture some plants and see what was going on with them. So some people said, well, you know, we're a botanical garden, so these plants have to look fantastic all the time. So in the summertime, you better water them 3 or 5 days a week. Other people said, no, they're desert plants. Let's water them once a week. So what they did is they put all these plants in these rows. They're the same plants planted at the same time in the same soil, and they started watering them at these different watering intervals. And the only difference they saw between these different watering intervals was how fast they grew. Those two brittle bush were planted at the same time. One of them just grew faster because it was watered more. Now, I know a lot of people, especially with new landscapes, they will try to do what we call push the landscape and force it to grow faster. So we've got good sized plants out there because when you pay a lot of money for that brand new desert landscape, depending on the size plants they put in, you've got these tiny little twigs sticking out of the ground. So I do understand it, but especially with plants like brittle bush, which are fairly short-lived perennials, if you're pushing a short-lived perennial with excess water, you're going to shorten its lifespan. When it comes to your trees, remember the number one thing we want out of our trees is shade. And we got our trees that we use out there like the mesquites, which is a really good hard wood. But if you're pushing and accelerating its growth with excess water, you're actually elongating the cell structure within that tree and making it a weaker tree. So some patience is a good idea out there. Now, in addition to these different watering regimens that they thought would be a good idea, where all they saw were different growth rates, they took another set of these plants, planted at the same time in the same soil. And what they did with those plants is they watered them nice and deep, the way we want to, and they didn't water them again until the plants actually showed signs of physiological water stress. Now, this photo was taken in the middle of summer, and these plants are only about 6 months old. So that one group of plants that they watered well and didn't water again until they actually showed signs of water stress was 6-month-old plants in the middle of summer. It was 21 days before they actually started showing water stress. So many people definitely water those plants much more often than what they really need. So you do hear a lot of conflicting advice out there. The old joke is ask 10 landscapers how to water and you'll get 20 answers. It may even seem that way when you're looking at the recommendations that we give you. If you look at our little yellow card here where it's broken out between trees and shrubs and whether they're high water use or low water use, and the 4 seasons we get here, which is winter, spring, summer, and fall. In the summertime, we're saying a desert shrub should be watered once every 7 to 21 days. What was it, 7 to 21? The answer, unfortunately, is yes, because there's a lot of plants out there we call low water use, and some are thirstier than others. There's also the issue going on here where we're telling you to change your watering only 4 times a year, and our supposed summer season here is May through October. There's a big difference in plant water needs between June and October. In October, we still have the high daytime temperatures up in the 100-degree range, but there's a big difference in the nighttime temperatures, and that has a huge impact. You know, at 4:30 in the morning when I get up for work in June, it's 92 degrees outside. In the middle of October, when I get up at 4:30 and head outside in the backyard in my bare feet, it's really, really cold because it's only in the mid 60s. So that has a huge impact out there. So actually changing your watering schedule even more often than this will help you use the right amount of water at the right time.
Hey,
So,
Jeff.
yes,
Hey, this is Drew. I have a couple of questions. One was, would you be covering the water needs for like lemon trees or citrus trees?
absolutely.
Okay. And then I guess the other question was, will these principles be applied to like container gardening?
Container gardening is definitely kind of covered in here because what's going on with that is you're just using a different type of soil type rather than our clay soil out there, and also in raised containers above ground. That soil is going to dry out even much more quickly than it would with our native clay soil in the ground. So really your big difference on those is you're going to be watering those containers much more often than plants in the ground would need. Typically, container gardening also deals with higher water use plants many times, especially if you're doing trying to do some vegetable container gardening. Things like your tomatoes and peppers that are a higher water use plant. So you'll find in the middle of summer, you may be watering them every 1 to 2 days, whereas your desert adapted plants out in the soil, if they're established, may only need to be watered once every 9 days.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
Yep. So some of your main questions when it comes to figuring out how to be watering the plants in your yard is, first of all, how? And by that we mean, well, what kind of irrigation are you using? Are they sprinklers for the grass? If so, what kind of sprinklers? Are they shrubs and trees? Are you using drip systems? Are you using bubblers? And how fast are they putting out the water? When it comes to the question of when, what we really mean by that is time of day. And it's always best when possible to water through the middle of the night, especially with your lawns because those sprinklers are throwing the water up into the air. So that means no matter what, some of that water is being lost to evaporation. So by watering at night, you're going to minimize that. And I know people from the Midwest, you're scared of watering the grass through the middle of the night, but this is the desert. You're not going to cause yourself any disease problems if you're watering properly. When it comes to where, well, with grass, it's everywhere as evenly as possible. Otherwise, you're going to get some brown spots. With shrubs and trees, it's going to be a little bit different. And we have a graphic coming up here in a minute that'll show you how to kind of think your way through that. The biggies and the great thing that this brochure does is get you to figure out how much and how often based on your landscape and your irrigation system. Not mine or your neighbors, but your irrigation system. So really what Don and Robin, the other author of this book, did is they broke it down to the three simplest base concepts of what's going on here. First, you have to know how much water your plants need, not mine, not your neighbors. Then you have to know how much water your irrigation system applies, not mine, not your neighbors. And then just put those two things together. You know, this brochure really was a breakthrough because for decades, our recommendations from water conservation when talking to people about how to water was always saying water deeply and infrequently, which is very, very good advice, but it doesn't do you any good once you're standing next to that timer mounted to the side of your house. So this brochure really gets you a good starting point for how much runtime and how often based on your yard and your irrigation system. So first off, you want to figure out how much to water, and you also want to consider how deeply that water is going. So your more delicate stuff, your little annuals and things like that, you want to water to about a foot deep. Your medium to large size shrubs, you want to water about 18 to 24 inches deep. And then your trees at maturity, obviously this is at maturity, not when you first plant them. Your trees, you want to water at 2 to 3 foot depth. Now, when it comes to grass, you only really want to water your grass about 6 to 10 inches deep. So now the big question is, how do you know how deep the water's going after you run your irrigation? Well, there's two ways to do it. There's the hard way. Run your irrigation and wait an hour or so the water settles down to its final depth and go out with a shovel and dig until you hit dry soil. That's the hard way. The easy way is to know the characteristics of our soil. Our clay soil, when it's dry, is the consistency of concrete. But every time we want to dig a hole or dig a trench for something out there, we know to go out there and wet it down a little bit first, so that way it becomes much more plastic and pliable. So by using what we call a soil probe, after you do your watering, a soil probe is nothing more than a long metal rod. Now, if you're just checking for your grass because you only want to go 6 to 10 inches deep, a nice long Phillips head screwdriver works really, really well. It will slide easily through the moist soil and it will stop when it hits the depth of water. For your shrubs and trees where you're looking for a deeper watering profile, you're just going to want a longer rod. Whether it's a metal bar that you buy from a home improvement store, maybe bend one end over so you have a nice handle. Another great option is to check with the Maricopa County Master Gardeners Group. They actually make and sell nicely made, pre-made soil probes. Double check with them first because of the coronavirus. Their office is closed to the public, so check with them and make sure that those are still available for sale at this point in time. So when it comes to where, this is where we were talking about earlier is remember, when you're running your irrigation system, you are not watering plants. You're watering roots. So at the very beginning, when these plants are first planted, let me see if I can work my little annotation thing here. So you've got this brand new plant with this tiny little root zone. You're going to put that emitter right on top of that root ball. But as your shrubs and trees start growing, you're going to want to keep up with that canopy or drip line of the plant material and move those emitters out, and then also add them in as time goes on so you're watering evenly around the plant. So you're doing this to ensure that you're growing a nice, deep, well-developed root system, particularly when it comes to your trees. Every time we have a storm here in the valley, every news channel is out there standing next to a tree laying on the ground. And when you're looking at that tree that they're standing next to, look at the roots, or more importantly, the lack thereof. Desert adapted plant material, one of their adaptations is they are very, very opportunistic. So what happens is during the rainy season, they do all their growth up top, up in the canopy. It's during the dry season they do their root development. But now we've got all these trees out there with those two emitters still at the original location right next to the trunk, watering 3 days a week. When is the dry season? It's never. Now, sometimes we're fortunate and the trees ignore our foolishness and they send out their roots anyway. But many times they don't. They will actually not bother growing any roots because they've got all the water they need right there. And if you've got a tree with a 20-foot wide canopy and still the original root ball size from what came from the nursery, it doesn't matter how many tree stakes you put next to that thing, you're not going to be able to keep that thing standing. That's the whole thing with irrigation is water your roots, not your plants. Now, as far as figuring out how much water your irrigation system applies, if you have a lawn, you're using sprinklers, so you're throwing that water up in the air, which means you can catch it and measure it. So the brochure does walk you through how to do what they're calling your sprinkler can test. And what you want to use is catch cans that have straight sides and flat bottoms. So that's why we always talk about using tuna cans or cat food cans. And they also all have the same size opening. So don't use like a coffee cup and a dish pan. You'll get wildly different results. So you're just going to randomly scatter the cans out in the yard, and you're going to run the system for 15 minutes, and then you're going to measure how much water fell in each of the cans. And one thing you're going to find out very, very quickly is what we call the uniformity of a sprinkler system. They do not apply the water perfectly evenly in the areas they cover, so some cans will have more water than other cans. So what they're going to do is they're going to have you get the average depth out of all those cans. So really what you're doing here, I know it seems kind of silly, but this is really the true way to know exactly how many minutes to run your sprinkler system. And I know people want to be helpful at places like home improvement stores and nurseries, and they'll give you advice about how long to run your sprinklers. If they don't know anything about your sprinkler system, they could do much more harm than good. The sprinklers I use on my lawn in my backyard apply the water very, very slowly, much more slowly than a standard sprinkler nozzle. So I actually run my sprinklers for 90 minutes. That's how long it takes me to apply 3/4 of an inch to my grass. So this is a real way to find out just how long to run your sprinklers, not my sprinklers. And really what you're doing is the same thing that I would do as a certified irrigation auditor. It's just that if we showed up to this apartment community with a big bag full of Friskies and Whiskas cans, they would never take us seriously. So in that case, what we're doing to make sure that it looks all scientific, is we're just using these little scientific looking little catch cans out there. So we just do a little extra math to turn that into the depth of water that was applied out there. But it's exactly the same thing that we did here to figure out exactly how long to run those sprinklers. So in your brochure, after you get your average depth out of all the cans, there's going to be this table in there. And based on what you got, it's going to tell you exactly how many minutes to run your sprinklers. And what they're doing here is they're getting you to apply 3/4 of an inch of water to your grass when you water. And the funny thing about this is a lot of your landscape contractors out there, if you talk to them about this book, they kind of chuckle and say, well, that's not really how you water. But really, all the scientific calculations that I would use as a certified irrigation auditor are done in that table. They're just hid behind the scenes so we don't scare you. So really, a soil profile of 8 inches in our soil from bone dry to full water capacity is about 1.5 inches. Now, if we want to let half that water get used up before we water again, that's 3/4 of an inch. So if your average can depth out of your test was 0.4 inches, that means you run your sprinklers for 28 minutes. Now, some people are a little bit better at math than others, so somebody might have actually said, well, actually, my average depth was 0.45. So in that case, your runtime is going to be right in between that 28 and 22 minutes. So that would be right at 25 minutes. Now we've just shaved 3 minutes of runtime off of that maximum potential runtime that we figured out with our test. Is that really a lot of water savings? You'd be surprised. Many people just really don't understand just how many gallons per minute are running through those sprinkler systems when they're operating. We find it very, very common out there that people are running 16 or 18 gallons a minute with these sprinkler zones. So 3 minutes of less runtime on a 20 gallon per minute zone is 60 gallons of water savings. That still doesn't sound like a lot, but consider how many times a year that sprinkler system is running. Just that fine tuning of those few minutes of adjustment will have a big impact on your annual water use. Now, some people are still using bubblers out there to water shrubs or trees, and actually with citrus trees, it is a much better way to water because when that tree gets large, you want to give it a large quantity of water when you water it, and that's very hard to do with drip irrigation. It takes lots and lots of emitters delivering their water in gallons per hour to match what a bubbler can do in gallons per minute. So some of them are preset and some of them are adjustable. We actually do recommend if you're using bubblers to use the preset pressure compensating ones. So that way every single location is putting out exactly the same amount of water and you know exactly how much water is coming out of each one. With the adjustable ones, you're just not sure how many gallons per minute is being delivered to that plant at each location. More commonly, what we find out there with our shrubs and trees is our drip irrigation. And remember, drip emitters do deliver the water in gallons per hour. So some of your emitters out there, let's get a little annotate thing here. That little emitter right on the face of it right there actually does say 1 GPH. That emitter is actually pretty small, so it's really, really hard to read. That's why many of your manufacturers will actually color code them. So you'll find different colors for different output rates of those emitters. Now, there's no industry standard for what those colors mean. Each manufacturer makes up their own color coding system. So whatever emitter you're using, whatever brand you're using, just make sure you remember what colors they're using as to whether it's a 1/2, 1, or 2 gallon per hour emitter. Now this guy over here is labeled with an 8, and that doesn't mean it's supposed to be an 8 gallon per hour emitter. That one is not manufactured in America, so that is 8 liters per hour. So that's telling you that that emitter actually is putting out 2 gallons of water per hour. Unfortunately, with this style of emitter, which is very, very common out there, they got these little flags on there. That's why they're called flag emitters. They do not do something called pressure compensation. That emitter is nothing more than a hole in a piece of plastic. So the more pressure that's put there, the more water comes out. The less pressure, the less water comes out. So we'll see these emitters where they're labeled as 2 gallon per hour emitters or 8 liter per hour emitters. But when you actually turn them on and look at them, they can be putting out as much as 10 or 12 gallons of water per hour on those first emitters on the zone. But the last emitters on that same zone, because there's less pressure there, are now only putting out 2 gallons of water per hour. It just makes that system impossible to manage. They apply the water too fast to the soil where that little stream of water hits. So that's why you see those short run times out there, which means you're not watering deep and developing root systems. So they're not any cheaper than good quality pressure compensating emitters, and they waste water and they make trees fall over. So if you've got these guys out there, just switch them out to pressure compensating emitters. Fortunately, the flag emitters are always installed above ground at the end of that little 1/4-inch spaghetti tubing. So it's just a matter of clipping them off and putting on the correct emitters. That will change your runtime dramatically, though. Oops, let's get out of here. There we go. Okay, the brochure also has a handy little chart in there that shows you kind of visually what the output rate kind of looks like. So you'll get pretty good at eyeballing these emitters and figuring out just how much water is coming out of them. So if you're running a 1 gallon per hour emitter, really what you're going to see is individual, separate, but constant drips of water. What you're going to see is drip, 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 drip. Why do you think we call them drip systems? This is how it's supposed to look when it's coming out. And people get confused and they say, oh, something's wrong. It's not putting out any water. Drip irrigation, by applying that water nice and slowly, will soak into our clay soil. And the nice thing about our clay soil is because it's that tight soil with very little pore space in between those soil particles, is as it is percolating down, capillary action is also pulling it sideways. So that wet spot you see underneath the emitter is really the very, very top of a big onion shape in our clay soil. Now, those of you that are doing that container gardening, this type of emitter is not going to work for you because that water will just drop straight down underneath that emitter and not spread out whatsoever. So you're going to use a different type of emission device that's going to actually put out that water much more quickly and spread it out so all the soil gets wet. That's going to be a very, very different runtime compared to what we see with the traditional drip system. Now, one thing to think about, we see these runtimes in these drip irrigation systems when we go out and inspect them, and it's very common for us to see these 15-minute runtimes. Now, if you've got a drip emitter out there, a 1 gallon per hour emitter that's actually putting out 1 gallon of water per hour, and you only run it for 15 minutes, you've given that plant a quart of water. Now, obviously, if you were doing that by hand, remember how we used to do it with the old garden hose? If you've got a garden hose open and it's putting out 8 gallons of water per minute, that means to deliver that same quart of water, it would take 2 seconds. Think about that if you were wandering around your yard with a garden hose. Would you really do that? 1001 for this plant, 1002 for that plant, 1001, 1002 for that plant. It's very obvious to us that that is not nearly enough water, but people get confused with drip systems, especially when they hear suggestions where you might need to run it anywhere from 2 to 4 hours of time. But if you have a 1 gallon per hour emitter and you run it for 4 hours, you've given that plant 4 gallons of water. So now with the catch can test you do with your sprinklers, you're actually calculating out what we refer to as your precipitation rate, how many inches per hour that irrigation system is applying. To do that with drip irrigation, it's a very long, complex formula. It has to do with the wetted area and based on the soil type and all that sort of stuff. So what Donna and Robin have done with this is just looked at the volume of soil that that plant should have based on the plant diameter, its canopy diameter. So with watering trees deeper than shrubs, you've got a bigger volume of soil you're trying to wet. So what we've got going on here is if you've got some shrubs out there and it's a 4-foot wide shrub, you're going to come down the shrub line. Maybe I should have used a different color there until you reach the 4-foot column. And now you're going to see I want to give that shrub 12 gallons of water. So they've made it very, very simple for you. And this is also another reason why you want to make sure you're using pressure compensating emitters. Because within a range of pressures, a PC emitter, if it's rated at 1 gallon per hour, is going to put out 1 gallon per hour unless it fails. But those flag emitters, you have no idea how much water is coming out of each one. So you cannot make this translation here. That's another reason why it's so important to use a quality pressure compensating emitter that on average will cost you about 4 to 6 cents more than those flag emitters. Now, one thing we are going to see here, let me see if I can change my color a little bit here to make it a little bit easier for you to see, is when you start getting out to these trees, those numbers start getting very, very large. So one thing you're thinking about there with that 20-foot tree, you're not really watering all 20 feet underneath that tree 3 feet deep with your drip irrigation system. And that's actually not what that number would be to truly wet all 20 feet diameter underneath that tree 3 feet deep. That would actually be over 600 gallons. So this is only about 40% of that area. Now with your desert adapted trees, once they start growing and start putting out those root systems in the native desert out there, they've done some excavation on those tree root zones, and they have found some of those trees have root zones that are 3 to 5 times wider than the canopy itself. So what's going on out there is those trees are dependent on nothing more than rainfall. They do not have drip irrigation systems out there. So these trees are fishing for water. And if you're a fisherman and you want to catch more fish, that means you get a bigger net. That is one of the adaptations of our desert trees. So very often with your desert trees, you're going to stop somewhere in this 38 to 59 gallon range and understand that those trees will continue to put out even more roots further than that, and they will also pick it up from other locations. Things like your neighbor's lawn, your neighbor's overwatered landscape. Once you get those roots heading out in that area, they will find that other water out there. The difference would be with things that do need more water, things like citrus trees, because now you're watering for a whole different reason. With a desert adapted tree at maturity, really all you're watering for is some aesthetics. The tree will live perfectly fine on rainfall, but you'll find in these hot, dry summers, especially this year, where there hasn't been any rainfall, one of the adaptations of our desert trees is dropping their leaves. Because it's so hot, they really don't want to transpire any of their water away. It's so hot, they can barely do any photosynthesis anyway. Now, if you've got a big Palo Verde tree next to your house, do you want it dropping its leaves in the middle of summer? Because that's what they do in the native desert. So with your drip irrigation system, now that is considered supplemental water when these desert trees get to maturity. Citrus trees, you're watering for a whole different reason. You're watering to make that nice, juicy, sweet orange at the end of the year. So if there's any vegetable gardeners out there, you know what's going on with zucchini. Why do you guys plant 8 zucchini plants? No family on the planet can eat that much zucchini. Citrus is kind of like that. So you like oranges, so you plant an orange tree. Maybe you'd also like some grapefruit, so you plant a grapefruit tree. No family on the planet is going to be able to utilize all that fruit, so you've got to give it away, just like people, those gardeners with that zucchini do. And if you underwater those fruit trees when they're producing that fruit, your friends, neighbors, and family and coworkers are going to get very good at avoiding you from January through March because they don't want to take that bag of dry, pithy fruit from you. So with a citrus tree, you actually are going to want to follow these guidelines, and that's why bubbler irrigation is a better way to water those high water use trees like citrus.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes.
Got another question. It's
Okay.
in regards to what the watering needs for like a queen palm would be.
Well, the queen palm is going to be a higher water use tree, but really when you're looking at this table, there is no differentiation between high water use and low water use because really at this point, all we're looking at is the volume of soil you're trying to wet based on the size of the shrub or the tree. What's going to change between a low water use shrub and a high water use shrub, same with trees, with the exception of citrus, is how often you have to reapply the water. So a higher water use tree like the queen palm is going to need to be watered more often than a low water use palm tree like the Mexican fan palm tree. That's where the difference is going to happen. Not the quantity of water you give it, but how often you need to water it.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, and they can refer to that the high water use versus the desert adapted trees in that watering by the numbers guide too, probably.
Yep, and we're going to show that in just a moment here.
Cool. Thank you.
So what you're going to do is now that you know how many gallons of water your plant needs or your tree needs, you're going to match it up to your total output there. And they've got a neat little runtime worksheet here in the brochure. And they even give you a nice little kind of example of what that looks like. And there is some math when it comes to irrigation, but I promise you they've made this as easy as it can possibly be. So here we're actually going to run through a quick little example. So let's say on our first zone, valve, or station, whichever way you want to refer to it, on average, it's all shrubs out there, and on average, they're about 2 feet wide. Now, this is science, but it's not rocket science, so don't go out there with a tape measure and measure your plants. Just kind of look them over and say, yeah, they're about 2 feet wide. Now, in this example, each shrub has one 1 gallon per hour emitter on it. So that means when we run that zone, each plant is getting 1 times 1 gallon per hour emitter is 1 gallon per hour per plant. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look and see how many gallons that 2-foot shrub needs. So we're going to come down to the shrub line and we come to the 2-foot column and we see that shrub needs 4 gallons of water. Let me get my annotation out of here. Now, if we're delivering 1 gallon of water to the plant and it needs 4 gallons of water, then that runtime should be 4 hours. In our next example here, zone number 2, fortunately they've got this done correctly where the trees are on a separate zone. The trees are about 8 feet wide and each tree has 3 2-gallon per hour emitters on it. So that means when we're running that station or zone, each tree is getting 3 times 2, which is 6 gallons of water per hour. So once again, we come down to our table in the book, but this time we're looking at trees because we want to water deeper. And we want to come out to the 8-foot column and see that we want to give that tree 38 gallons of water. So now we take 38 and divide it by 6 to figure out our runtime. So 38 divided by 6 gallons per hour would be 6 hours, 17 minutes, and 22 seconds. Don't do the math that far. It's drip irrigation. Call it 6 hours. You're in good shape. So once again, notice we're not talking about the difference between high water use and low water use. We're just looking at the plant, whether it's a shrub or a tree. and how big it is so we know how many gallons of water to give it. So on station number 3 here, they actually do have some small young citrus trees here that are about 4 foot wide on average. Now on these, each one is getting 2 gallons per minute with a bubbler. So when we run that zone, each tree is getting 2 gallons per minute. So to figure out how many gallons of water to give that citrus tree, we come down once again to trees until we get to 4 feet. And then we see we want to give that citrus tree 16 gallons of water. So 16 gallons of water divided by 2 gallons per minute is 8 minutes. Remember, sprinklers and bubblers deliver the water in gallons per minute, so you program that runtime in minutes. Drip irrigation delivers the water in gallons per hour, so you're going to program those runtimes in hourly increments. So a lot of you are probably in this scenario. Unfortunately, it's way too popular or way too common. Shouldn't say popular, just common. And they actually show you what's going on in their example here on your runtime worksheet, where they've got zone number 1 as 8-foot trees, 3-foot shrubs, and 2-foot succulents. And what they came up with was 3 different runtimes. Well, you can't do that because it's all on the same zone. It's going to run for that one runtime that you program in for that station. So it would have been better when that site was installed, when that landscape was installed, to have it designed properly where the shrubs are on a separate line from the trees. So that way you can run your tree zone longer to deliver more water and also less frequently because you're giving them a bigger deposit. Well, you're probably not going to dig up and reinstall your irrigation system at this point for thousands and thousands of dollars. But one thing you can do is manipulate the delivery of the water by changing your emitter count. So here, instead of 3 emitters there, we added in 2 more for 5 and brought that runtime down close to 4 hours. With our succulents, instead of a 1 gallon per hour emitter, we put in a 0.5 gallon per hour emitter. So now instead of 2 hours, our runtime is 4 hours. So now at least everyone's kind of happy with the same runtime. Now the only battle you're going to have is the watering interval. How many days in between waterings? You're always going to have to water to the thirstiest plant on that zone. So it's going to be your shrubs, which means you're going to water your trees a little bit more often than what you really need to. But in that scenario, short of digging up and starting over, that's going to be your best way to handle that. Let's see, we got about 8 minutes left here and we are almost done. So now we do have our run times. Now we know exactly what we should be programming into that timer for how many minutes for our sprinklers and how many minutes for our bubblers for those citrus trees, how many hours for our drip irrigation stations. So now what you're going to do is you're going to leave those run times alone. What drives how deep the water goes into the soil is how long you run the irrigation. Very often what people do here is when it starts getting cooler into the fall and winter months, they start shortening that run time. That means you're watering less deeply. When it got cold, did the roots on your landscape plant material shrink? No, what has changed is the water is being used less quickly. So what you want to change is not how long you water, but how often you water. And that's where we have this nice table here where it's broken out between trees, desert adapted, and high water use. So those of you that were asking about queen palms, your watering interval for your queen palms would be your high water use trees. So in the middle of summer, every 7 to 10 days, fall every 7 to 12 days, and then in the wintertime, every 14 to 30 days. Yet people water those queen palms 5 days a week year round, and they wonder why they don't look very good. In addition to the fact that queen palms don't like our soil and they don't like our climate here in the desert, but nurseries sell them because people keep buying them. So also when it comes to thinking about how frequently we water, think about what's going on with our weather. I know it seems like it, but we do not go from our daytime highs in the wintertime of about 68, 65 degrees, and then all of a sudden we get to 112 degrees, and then we do this. That's what's happening when you do that watering schedule change only twice a year. You're actually underwatering your plants here and here, and then you've got all this potential for savings there. So again, by adjusting your watering even more often than those 4 times a year is even better. And I think we do talk about a number that you can text to to get your monthly watering reminders. So what you're seeing here is our maximum water needs is typically in June. It's the longest daylight length, it's the warmest daytime temperatures and the warmest morning temperatures. We also have that daily breeze coming in and out of the valley, goes up the slopes when the valley warms up in the morning, and then in the evening as the valley cools back down, that wind comes back down the slopes of the mountains around us. Lowest amount of humidity. So what I've got here on this next slide is an hourly reading for an entire year. So these green lines here is the hourly temperature for the entire year. The yellow lines are the hourly humidity readings for the entire year. So what you're seeing here in June, you've got the highest daytime temps and the highest low temps. Then you can see when we get into, let me erase that real quick so it makes it a little bit more clear. We are really just learning how to do this stuff. But now when you started getting into July, you'll see our temperatures are still similar as to what we saw in June. But now look at the difference on what's happening with your humidity. Think about it. When you're outside working in your yard in May or June, you get that layer of perspiration on your arm and the breeze comes by and it evaporates and it feels wonderful, gives you that nice cooling effect. Well, this morning I saw it was 30-some%. Actually, I'm looking at my weather station right now, and according to my weather station, we're at a 29% humidity right now. So if you were working outside in your yard right now, you'd get that layer of perspiration on your arm, and if the breeze came by, nothing would happen because the air is already saturated with moisture. So the same thing is going on with your plants. Yet people tend to water more during the monsoon season because they're less comfortable. Your plants actually need less water going on there. Then what you're going to find in the wintertime is not only their lower average temperatures between morning and night, but if we get our rainfall, you're also getting very high humidity. You're getting the double benefit of less water needs because that ET is lower and any usable rainfall that actually falls on your yard. A couple more slides here and then we'll be done. Now on the quarterly chart here, we do talk about those monthly watering intervals to water grass. Grass is going to be one of your higher water use plants unless you're growing citrus trees out there. So really by changing your watering schedule more often than that quarterly recommendation, you're going to use less water over the course of the year. So now when you're watering your grass in the middle of summer, that hot, horrible time of June, you're going to water that grass with whatever your catch can test told you to run it, that 28 minutes or whatever your test showed you, but you only need to do it every 3 days. You don't need to be watering that grass 5 to 7 days a week in the middle of summer. The advantage of getting that water deeper is you're losing less of it to evaporation. You're getting it into that nice clay soil where the roots are. And it's not just about water savings either, because once you develop those good root systems on that grass, if you're somebody who's watering every single day and you have very shallow roots on your grass, irrigation systems malfunction. You miss one irrigation event on that shallow rooted grass in June, and it is instantly in shock and stress and turning brown. Whereas if you've got that well-built reservoir of moisture in that well-developed root zone, you can go a few days before you get out there and have to fix that irrigation system. So it's not just about water savings, it's about a healthier landscape. If you do put in winter grass, which a lot of people do, typically that's done in October, but once you get it established, you're going to move back to those full run times of what your catch can test told you. And you'll see in December, you're going to water that grass every 14 days. People overwater that ryegrass that we use for our winter grass here, and it's already a plant material that has a very high water content, and then we just water the heck out of it and we turn it into soup, and then every 10 feet of pushing your mower, you've got to stop and tip it up on the side and scoop out all the green goop that's clogging up your mower. Change how you water by watering deeper and less often, and you won't have that problem. It goes away all on its own. Okay, next when it comes to how frequently we water, we do need to consider microclimates. So if it's on that west side right next to the west wall and the big driveway out there, it's getting all that reflected heat. That's the other thing of that 7 to 21 day range we talked about for desert adapted plants in the summertime. is if it's in a protected microclimate, it can go more days in between watering. But if it's in that really hot microclimate with lots of reflected heat, it's not going to be able to go as long in between waterings. Also, when it comes to soil type, how we're applying the water, and this is what we were talking about with those container gardens. With your sandy soil, that water is going to drop straight through. You're going to get very little side-to-side spread. So you're going to use a different type of emission device that applies the water much more quickly and spreads it out. Something like some inline emitter tubing or some micro bubblers or even micro sprayers. Whereas that same application on a clay soil, this is what your penetration is going to look like. It's not going to drop through as fast and it's going to spread out a lot more sideways. That's why drip irrigation works so well on our clay soil, especially for our desert plants. And we're almost done here. We're almost at an hour already, so we got to finish up here pretty quickly. Now this chart here, when we're giving these recommendations, we're talking about this is how you water established plant material, which we would say on average is about 1 year for shrubs and about 3 years for trees. Obviously, you can't water a brand new 1 gallon shrub you drop in the ground in the middle of summertime once every 9 days. It's not going to do very well. So the brochure does have some recommended guidelines here, depending on whether you plant in summer or fall through spring. And you will see, obviously, the first couple weeks, you're going to water very, very often. But already within weeks 3 to 4, you should already start increasing that run time to give it more water and start giving it a little less often. So that by the time you get out to weeks 7 through 8, you're already out to once every 7 days. That is how quickly those root systems will develop, especially in the summertime. So in the wintertime, you're going to do it even less often. That's why we say a better time to plant is often in fall, unless it's a frost susceptible plant. Get those roots well established through that first fall, winter, and spring before the next heat of summer hits. So in summary, they've made it as simple as 1, 2, 3. How much water your plants need, not mine. How much water your irrigation system applies, not mine. Putting the two together. Just a couple last points to keep in mind, and we're going to wrap up here, and then we'll have some time to answer some questions. Obviously, we already talked about when to water, which is through the middle of the night, especially with grass stations. So if you've got grass stations, make sure you're watering them through the middle of the night, and if it takes a long time, it is okay to water your drip in the daytime. You're not throwing the water up in the air. You're not losing as much to evaporation. But if you don't have any grass stations, definitely run that drip system through the middle of the night. Also, salt accumulation. You know, one of our water sources here in the valley is the Salt River, and it's called that because it does have a sodium content. So what we're telling you is to never change your run times. Always run the exact same run time, so that water is going to push into the soil to the exact same profile every time. And each time that water is drawn up by the plant and evaporation, it's going to start leaving behind the layer of minerals that we do have in our water, and one of them is salt. So what you're going to want to do is once, maybe twice a year, is double your runtime. We call that a leaching cycle to flush those salts out away from the root system. Water runoff, especially with your sprinklers. You know, we came up with our little example there is you might need to run your sprinklers for 28 minutes. If you try and run your sprinklers for 28 minutes in one shot, all that water is going to run away from you because the sprinklers put down the water way faster than what our soil will take in. That's where you're going to use a programming trick called cycle and soak by using those extra start times on your timers. And we're going to actually be covering that in depth, how to do that next Thursday's class. I am an irrigation guy. That is my background. But I will tell you, I am a big fan of doing harvesting of rainwater whenever possible. Now, people ask about rain barrels and things like that, but if you've got a 30-gallon rain barrel, by looking back at that table in the Landscape Watering by the Numbers brochure, what are you going to be able to do with 30 gallons of water on your landscape? Maybe water a couple shrubs once. That's why your better opportunity is to do what we call passive rainwater harvesting, which is by changing the grading on your yard with swales to capture water where you want it and berms to actually put the plant material so they're not standing in water. On average, our valley gets about 7 inches of rainfall a year. So if you've got 1,000 square feet of roof on your house And you can take the 7 inches of rainfall that fell on that 1,000 square feet of roof and get it directed to 1,000 square feet of landscape that also receives 7 inches of rainfall. Your landscape now actually just got 14 inches of effective rainfall that year. That allows you to suspend your irrigation during those events and save even more water. And the last point here is observation. These are your plants, and especially if you've been somebody who's been watering very short run times very frequently, first of all, take it out in graduated steps and work your way out to our guidelines and pay attention to how the plants are responding. There's an old proverb out there that the best fertilizer for the garden is the gardener's shadow. That means get out there, pay attention to your plants, get a soil probe of some type. That is the best tool an irrigator can ever have. And one of the last and most important parts that Donna likes to point out is that plants don't save water, people do. And we actually see this, and this has actually been documented by a study that was done by Arizona State University, where they wanted to see the difference on the adoption of a better desert landscape area has had on water use in our area. And what they found is in some cases on a per square foot basis, those old high water use landscapes, lots of grass and high water use shade trees, the desert adapted landscapes per square foot were getting more water than those old high water use landscapes. Unfortunately, the headline in the newspaper said xeriscape doesn't save water. Well, it had nothing to do with the plants. It had everything to do with how the people were programming their watering timers, their irrigation controllers, and how well they were adjusting them. So the plants didn't need in nearly that much water, but that's how much water people were giving them. One last thing I want to point out here is if you're wondering how much water you should be using at your house, don't compare your water bill to your neighbors because they may have very different water needs based on how many people in the house and what their landscape looks like and whether they have a pool. Chandler doesn't have it yet. Our Arizona Municipal Water Users Association that we're both members of are working on it. But right now you can use Gilbert's online water calculator, which is simply gilbertaz.gov/water calculator. And you just answer some very simple questions about how you're using water inside the house. And then you're going to actually tell us what kind of landscape you have, how many square feet of grass, how many square feet of planted areas, and what kind of plant material you're using out there. Now, you're not going to be able to use our GIS aerials that we've actually linked to on ours, but use Google Earth or Google Maps to do your measuring and you'll be fine. And once you do that, then our little water calculator is going to tell you by month and by type how much water you really need to use at your house. And then you can actually put in 1,000-gallon increments. So if your bill says 9, that means you use 9,000 gallons. That's how you enter it. Once you put that in, we'll show you a nice little graph comparing you to how much water you needed to how much water, to how much water you actually used, which this is just a fake example I put together. Okay, so let's get to that last slide where you've got your contact information for both the city of Chandler and the town of Queen Creek, who have partnered up to provide this presentation for you today. So we do have about 2 minutes for questions.
Hey, Jeff. Yeah, we got a few questions here. The first one is, I have been told it's a good idea to utilize hydrotane to help reduce watering. Is this true and recommended?
Hydrotane, it sounds like one of those polymers that is used to absorb a lot of water and then release it more slowly. They actually work quite well, but what they're changing is not how much water the plant needs. That's going to be a constant based on the plant and based on the weather parameters. But what that will change is how often you water. So those kind of soil polymers, those water absorbing polymers that are used out there are used a lot on highway revegetation projects because they don't want to install an irrigation system out there when they do those re-veg projects. So what they're going to do is they're going to wet it down really well once when they first plant, and then those soil polymers will allow the slower release of that water to give those plants a better chance to get well established.
Okay, thank you. And then the next one is, When is the best time of year to start readjusting the times of week to water grass to avoid shocking the roots?
Well, it's awful funny because a lot of times grass is so heavily overwatered. If you change from 5 days a week to once every other day or once every 3 days, as long as you increase the water being delivered, very rarely will they show any signs of stress. Now, one thing I should point out about the grass, that also has to do with how high you mow it. A lot of people mow their grass very, very, very short, which means no matter what, the grass is going to have a much shorter root depth. So that's kind of like when you see on golf courses, if any of you go golfing, they water those greens not only every day in the summertime, but several times a day because that grass is less than a quarter inch high, mowed every single day. And it's also usually planted on a sand soil base. So they have to reapply that water very, very frequently because of how shallow the roots are and because of how the soil that they planted in. If you let your grass grow a little bit taller, you'll actually be able to use less water. And, people are very surprised when we say in the middle of summer, water your grass once every 3 days. Well, the lawn in my backyard, in the middle of summer, I water once a week. And if you think that's crazy, think about some of those older neighborhoods where they still get that flood irrigation, where they flood that whole yard. In the middle of summer, they only get that water once every 2 weeks. So if you have been watering very short, very shallow runs on your grass or even on your shrubs, don't take it in one shot. Take it in gradual steps. So instead of every day, go every 2 days with a little bit more water. Then go out to every 3 days and just pay attention. And I bet with your grass, it'll never skip a beat.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. The next question is there anybody slash business available that actually does the calculating of run times for us?
Well, for that, what you're going to want is a truly trained, qualified landscaper or irrigation specialist. And unfortunately, a very small percentage of those people out there actually have that formal training to understand all the math that went behind this brochure that people like certified landscape irrigation auditors with the Irrigation Association, which is very in-depth, math-heavy training. It's very expensive. And because not many people actually request services like that, there's not many of those people in the state. There is in-state training that is offered by different groups. There's some great training that's offered by the Arizona Landscape Contractors Association, whether it's their Arizona Certified Landscape Professional program. They actually do have some irrigation technician training out there. So those are the types of people you're going to want to find. The training program that we're involved with, all the Arizona Municipal Water User Association cities, is called Smartscape. So you can go up on our website, which is smartscape.org, to find a person who's gone through our training. Now, the standard Smartscape training is 10 classes and it's broad. It talks about plant material, it talks about soils, we even cover pests and diseases, and we do have some irrigation training in there. Additionally, we have an add-on module called Advanced Smartscape, which is nothing but training on irrigation. So definitely look for those people. They've actually gotten the training on how to do it right.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. I got two more, it looks like. Where is a good place to go to learn about setting up a drip slash bubbler system in my yard?
As far as how to design and install a system, that is usually one of the classes we offer in the fall. Unfortunately, it's really hard to do that translation on a virtual type class the way we're forced to do it now with the current situation. One of the things is when we do our normal in-person classes, historically, these classes have been 2.5 to 3 hours long. And an online course taken over where you're watching it on your computer or your phone or your tablet, very few people are going to sit through a 3 hour class. So we're trying to figure out how to break that up into a couple of different pieces and see if that'll work. Hopefully in the near future, we will be actually offering that class in person as soon as it's safe for everyone to do so. In the meantime, you've got a lot of great resources out there, and one of your great resources are your irrigation supply stores. I have nothing against the home improvement stores. I shop there regularly, but as an irrigation expert, I don't need to ask them questions on what I should do, what I should buy, and what I should stay away from. So your irrigation supply stores, those people have years of experience working in the field on irrigation. And they also know who the good contractors out there as well. They know who are buying the right parts and who aren't buying the right parts. So your common irrigation supply stores here in the valley, they've got stores in pretty much every city in the valley, are going to be places like Ewing Irrigation, EWING, Horizon, Sprinkler World, and then Site One. And Site One is SITE hyphen ONE. So it's kind of spelled out. So those counter salespeople are going to be a great resource for you as well, as far as making sure you're getting things done correctly.
All right, and the last question it looks like that we have is, I have a Rainbird system that has an automatic seasonal adjustment option. Do you recommend using this or making manually quarterly adjustments?
Well, it depends on which particular timer you're talking about. There are some timers out there where you can pre-program in, say, yes, in June I want 100% of my runtime, July 97 or 95%, and so forth throughout the year. If that's the type your controller is doing, that's actually not a good idea, because all that is doing is changing how long the zones run, which means you're still watering at the same interval in the wintertime as you were in the summertime, but much less runtime. So now you're doing short, shallow watering. Now, there are some Rainbird timers out there that are what we call smart timers. And one of them out there does have the ability to adjust the days between watering, because it measures the weather every single day. And you've answered questions in there instead of how long to run and how often to run. You've answered questions like what type of plant is it, what kind of soil is it, and how fast is the irrigation applying the water. That creates a good watering schedule for you, and then makes those adjustments automatically based on desert daily weather throughout the year. But the ones that only adjust the run times only, those are the kind of smart timers you want to stay away from. They work really, really well in other areas of the country where they don't have such a big difference between our January watering and our June watering. Even if you're inside the state, just going up to Payson or Flagstaff, they're not watering their landscapes in the wintertime, especially in Flagstaff. They're under snow. So they have a very short watering season. So just doing a little runtime adjustment is perfectly acceptable. But down here in our valley, where we're doing massive extremes between winter and summer watering, whatever smart timer you use, you want to make sure it has the ability to adjust the days between watering, not just the runtime.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. It looks like that is all the questions that we have. I just wanted to mention that we do actually have since you mentioned the smart irrigation timers, we do actually have a smart irrigation controller class coming up. You can register the same spot that you registered for this class. It'll be there. I just want to thank you, Jeff, for an excellent presentation, and thank you all the attendees for joining our class today. As you can see, we have our contact information and our websites listed for more information or resources. We do have a short survey about the ABCs to landscape watering class that will pop up once you leave the virtual class. We do appreciate it if you'd please just take a minute to complete that so we can use it to improve our classes in the future. But thank you again, everyone, and thank you, Jeff. We hope everyone has a great rest of the week.